Hello there, and welcome to Forgotten Worlds. My name is Thomas, and tonight I invite you to settle in, let the day soften at the edges, and drift with me into a question that reshapes the ground beneath your feet. We rarely think about gravity. It's so constant, so invisible, that it becomes the quiet background to every moment of our lives. It's what holds the oceans in their basins, pulls raindrops toward the earth, and makes every step you've ever taken feel like it belongs to the ground. But what if that pull was different? What if the earth's gravity was only half of what it is today? Imagine standing outside on a calm evening. The air feels thinner somehow, the horizon stretched wider, as though the world itself has become lighter. You take a step, and your body moves farther than you expect. You reach for the sky, and for a moment it feels almost as though the sky is reaching back. This is not a debate, not a conclusion we need to rush toward, but an exploration, a chance to let science and imagination walk hand in hand. Because having the weight of the world changes everything, the shape of mountains, the way trees grow, the beat of your own heart. So tonight, let's drift into that possibility together. What would life be like on a gentler earth, a place where the pull of home is softer, and where every leap carries you a little closer to the stars? And to begin, let's start small, with the very physics of a lighter earth. To imagine such a world, we first have to loosen our grip on the planet we know. Gravity is not simply a force that pulls, it is a signature of mass, a quiet consequence of how much matter is gathered together beneath your feet. If Earth's gravity were cut in half, it would mean that our planet carried far less weight, perhaps only half the density, perhaps only half the mass that it does now. Picture the Earth not as the familiar blue sphere you've seen in photographs, but as something subtly changed, its pull gentler, its presence lighter, its whole body drifting closer to what astronomers might call a small exoplanet or a giant moon dressed in the disguise of a world. With weaker gravity, the very air you breathe would behave differently. Our atmosphere is held close to us by Earth's pull, pressed into a tight blanket that thickens at the surface. But loosen that grip, and the atmosphere begins to drift upward, spreading farther into space, its edge feathering out into the void. At ground level, the air would thin. You might notice it with each breath, a faint resistance, as though the atmosphere itself were reluctant to settle down near the surface. Imagine standing on such a world. The sky above you stretches higher, paler, its layers drawn upward like a veil caught in a gentle breeze. Clouds hover differently, their bases less tethered to the ground, their tops climbing to heights we cannot see on present-day Earth. A storm might rise not as a dense and heavy column, but as a towering formation that wanders into the upper reaches of the sky, billowing and delicate, almost weightless. Physics tells us that with lower gravity, pressure itself would change. Every raindrop, every grain of sand, every pebble you lift in your hand would weigh less. The laws of motion would feel familiar, yet somehow distorted. A ball tossed into the air would arc farther, hang longer, fall slower. Even sound would carry differently, traveling through thinner air with a muted, softened quality, less crisp, more like whispers suspended between spaces. And think too of the scale of landscapes. On the earth, you know, mountains are constrained by gravity. Build them too high, and their own weight pulls them down, crumbling, eroding, forcing even the tallest peaks into limits of stone. But on a world with weaker pull, rock could climb higher before collapse. Mountains might tower far above anything we know, ranges rising like jagged monuments into a sky stretched thinner and wider. It is a strange paradox. A lighter Earth would feel more open, more spacious, and yet perhaps more fragile. Without the strong press of gravity, the crust itself would rest differently on the molten mantle. Earthquakes might ripple farther, volcanoes fling their plumes higher. Even the ocean basins, spread wider by the relaxed pull, might swell and reshape, creating coastlines unfamiliar to our maps. If you could float above such a planet and look down, you might not immediately recognize it. The seas could shimmer across shallower bowls, spreading over land in sprawling networks. Forests would cluster differently under the higher sky. The continents might look similar in outline, but their surfaces, etched by the new dance of wind and water, would seem otherworldly, like a painting made with the same palette but brushed in new strokes. And yet, despite these differences, this half-gravity Earth would still be home. Its sun would still rise, casting light across oceans and plains. Its moon, though smaller in influence, would still drift across the night. Seasons would still turn, but the rules would be subtly rewritten, as if the world itself were tuned to a lighter, more delicate rhythm. Astronomers might look at such a planet from afar and call it strange but habitable. They might compare it to the moons of gas giants, places where low gravity sculpts the land into extremes. Perhaps they would note how thin the air is at the surface, how tall the clouds climb, how mountains tower higher than seems possible, and perhaps, with a touch of envy, they would wonder what it might feel like to stand there, to leap into the sky and linger in the air as if the world itself were reluctant to let you fall. So the physics of a lighter Earth paints us a portrait of a place both recognizable and alien. Thinner air, higher skies, taller mountains, slower falls. A planet reshaped not by some dramatic catastrophe, but by a gentler pull that touches everything, from the way rivers flow to the sound of your own voice drifting into the quiet night. When you loosen gravity's hand, you also loosen the boundaries that hold a planet's face in its familiar form. The Earth, you know, is sculpted by compromise. Mountains rise until their own weight pulls them down. Valleys deepen only as far as rock can resist collapse. Oceans pool into basins carved by pressure and tectonic force. But imagine if those limits were softened. Imagine a planet that could stretch taller, wider, stranger, because the pull that keeps everything bound is only half as strong. The first and most dramatic change would be seen in the mountains. On our present Earth, even the mighty Himalayas have a ceiling. Above a certain height, the weight of stone itself becomes unsustainable, and peaks crumble into avalanches and erosion. But in a world with weaker pull, rock would not feel so heavy. The crust could pile higher before its own burden broke it apart. Picture ranges not of 8 kilometers, like Everest, but of 20 or 30. Mountains so tall they vanish into the thin veil of atmosphere, their summits brushing against layers of sky where oxygen struggles to reach. Climbing such a peak would be less about surviving thin air, and more about stepping into another world altogether, one where clouds float below you and the sun sets in hues never seen from lower ground. And these mountains would not be alone. The whole skin of the Earth would be stretched differently. With weaker gravity, tectonic plates would move in slightly altered ways. Their collisions would still raise ranges, but those ranges could climb unchecked, more jagged, more extreme, carving skylines that make today's Alps or Andes look like foothills. Valleys carved between them might plunge deeper, cut wider, because rock itself resists collapse more easily in this gentler world. Now turn your eyes from the mountains to the oceans. On our Earth, water is drawn tightly into rounded basins, pulled into predictable seas, by gravity's firm grasp. Lower that grasp, and oceans begin to spread. They no longer huddle into deep pockets, but spill outward, covering coastlines in vast shallow sheets. Imagine standing at the edge of such a sea, not a sharp border between land and water, but a blurred, endless transition where the ocean stretches for miles across a plain only a few feet deep. Tides would roll farther inland, and the very idea of a coast would change. Instead of cliffs or beaches, you might find marshes extending hundreds of kilometers, shimmering mirrors of water that never seem to decide whether they belong to land or sea. These seas would shape the continents into unfamiliar silhouettes. Maps would not resemble ours, but would be smeared and softened, their outlines lost beneath sprawling shallows. Where rivers meet the ocean, deltas would spread wider, their branches meandering endlessly before they finally surrender to the sea. Estuaries might dominate the coasts, rich and strange, brimming with life adapted to a world where water does not sit still, but forever seeps across the land. Speculative landscapes become easier to imagine here. You might picture forests growing from the very edges of these shallow seas, trees with roots half submerged, stretching toward mountains that tower beyond the clouds. Deserts, too, would appear in more dramatic forms. Without gravity's strong hand, dunes could grow higher, their grains settling slowly, their ridges shaped by winds that push farther and more easily across the land. Standing in such a desert, you would see walls of sand rising like cathedrals, their tops collapsing, not with sudden crashes but with long drifting cascades, each grain reluctant to fall. Caves would deepen as well. On present-day Earth, caverns collapse under the weight of the roof above them. But on a lighter Earth, stone arches could span much greater distances before yielding. Imagine walking into a cavern vast enough to swallow an entire city, lit by shafts of thin daylight pouring through cracks high above. Whole subterranean landscapes could exist, valleys hidden beneath the crust, rivers flowing quietly through stone corridors, too wide to imagine. Even ice would sculpt the planet differently. Glaciers, freed from the heavy drag of gravity, would stretch higher and longer. Ice cliffs might rise like palaces of glass, their faces sheer and delicate, shedding snow that drifts slowly down like feathers. In polar regions, entire mountain ranges of ice could rise, not crumbling into the sea as quickly, but stacking themselves into towers that would gleam for centuries before they gave way. And then there are the plains, the quiet stretches of the world. On a half-gravity Earth, soil would scatter differently. Winds would travel farther, storms spreading their sediments over wide distances. The flatlands might look endless, a rolling canvas of grasses or forests, broken only by rivers that meander lazily, their flow slowed by weaker pull. From above, such plains might appear painted, wide strokes of green and gold, shimmering under a thinner sky. All of this makes the landscapes of a lighter Earth far more extreme than the ones you know. Taller mountains, deeper valleys, sprawling oceans, delicate coastlines, deserts of towering sand, caverns so wide they feel like underground skies. It would be a world where the very ground seems untethered, as if it has been given permission to stretch beyond ordinary limits. And yet, through all this strangeness, there is a kind of beauty. The rules of gravity may change, but the poetry of land and water, stone and ice remains. You would still walk along shores, still climb hills, still see rivers carve paths through valleys. But each of these familiar experiences would be heightened, exaggerated, stretched into forms that feel almost dreamlike. Perhaps that is the most striking thing about imagining a half-gravity Earth. It does not erase the planet we know, it amplifies it. Every mountain, every wave, every dune is allowed to grow taller, wider, stranger. The planet becomes itself, but more so. And as you stand in such a place, gazing across a horizon shaped by these new laws, you might feel both wonder and unease. For a lighter, Earth would be breathtaking, yes, but it would also be fragile, balanced on the edge of collapse, its landscapes exaggerated to a point where stability itself feels uncertain. If the very shape of the land bends beneath weaker gravity, then so too must the bodies that walk upon it. Evolution does not ignore the pull of the ground. It sculpts bone and sinew, muscle and posture, according to the weight they must carry. On a lighter earth, where every step presses down with only half the force, the human body would grow in unfamiliar ways. Our bones today are thick and dense, made to resist the constant demand of a full Earth's gravity. They are the quiet pillars that hold us upright against the tug of the planet. But with less weight to bear, those pillars would not need to be as strong. Over generations, skeletons would slim. The sturdy thickness of femurs and spines would soften into lighter frames. Collarbones, ribs, even the arches of feet would refine into more delicate structures, designed not for resistance but for efficiency. Muscles, too, would change. On this earth, your legs and back spend their lives lifting you out of gravity's embrace with every step. In half gravity, they would not be asked to work as hard. The human figure might become more elongated, muscles thinner, built less for brute force and more for graceful movement. Arms would no longer need to hoist heavy burdens. Backs would no longer be shaped by the need to resist collapse. Instead, bodies would grow long, flexible, and light, like reeds swaying in the air. Imagine walking across such a world. Your stride would not be the grounded pace you know, but something closer to a glide. Each step would carry you farther, your feet barely touching the soil before you rise again. A jump that now lifts you half a meter might instead launch you 2 or 3. Children would play by bounding from hill to hill. Adults would carry loads with ease that seems almost magical. And falling would no longer be the same threat it is here. Landings would be softer, gentler, less final. And yet there would be trade-offs. With lighter bones and muscles, humans would be fragile in ways that seem strange to us now. A stumble might not hurt as much because the impact is less severe, but the bones themselves would be easier to break. Collisions, even minor ones, could be dangerous. The heart, relieved of the burden of pumping against strong gravity, might not develop the same thick walls we know today. It would beat more lightly, its work easier, but its capacity for strain smaller. In a crisis, it could fail sooner. Speculation paints an even stranger picture. Over centuries, perhaps millennia, humans on such a planet might become tall, willowy beings, faces lengthened, limbs extended, their very proportions reshaped by the ease of existing under half the pull of home. A crowd of them might look to us almost alien, fragile silhouettes moving gracefully across the land, their bodies better suited for leaping and gliding than for lifting or wrestling. Consider the simple act of running. On this earth, it is a grounded rhythm, foot to ground, gravity pulling each step down. On a lighter earth, running would resemble flight. Strides would stretch so far that the ground might feel like an occasional visitor beneath your feet. Entire games, perhaps entire cultures, would form around this near superhuman capacity for movement. Acrobatics, leaps, flips, what is today the work of athletes and performers would be the everyday language of bodies adapted to a gentler pull. Even senses would adapt subtly. Balance, which relies on the inner ear's ability to track motion and tilt, would recalibrate to longer moments in the air. The vestibular system would learn to treat soaring leaps as normal. to adjust gently to slow landings. The nervous system might become attuned to lighter impacts, sharper to small collisions, but dulled to the heavy force we now expect. And what of childhood? Infants learning to walk would find themselves gliding almost as soon as they can stand. Falls, while less painful, would shape their awareness differently, teaching them not to fear the ground so much as to master the air. Growth itself might stretch them taller than we expect. Without gravity pulling hard at the spine, vertebrae would lengthen, posture would remain straighter, and humans might stand well over 2 meters on average. Their height not a rarity but a norm, but fragility is never far from beauty. A lighter skeleton would make bones brittle, a thinner muscle system would make bodies vulnerable to injury. These tall, thin forms might seem elegant, but they would also be delicate. A fall from even a short distance, though cushioned by weaker gravity, could fracture bones not built for impact. What we now call strength would be traded for grace, resilience exchanged for lightness. This raises a quiet, haunting question. Would such humans feel stronger, freed from the weight of the world, or weaker, bound by their own fragility? Perhaps both. They might dance across landscapes with ease, soaring where we stumble, but they would live always with the knowledge that their bodies, though agile, are breakable. In this balance lies the poetry of life on a half-gravity Earth, humanity reshaped into beings both extraordinary and vulnerable, taller than their ancestors, moving with near superhuman stride, but forever aware of the price of lightness, a species that could leap like shadows toward the sky, but that would snap easily if struck too hard by fate. If the human form itself would stretch and refine under gentler gravity, then so too would the span of life. Every heartbeat, every breath, every motion is shaped by the pull of the ground, and when that pull is eased, the rhythms of health and aging shift in subtle but profound ways. The first change would be kindness to the heart. On our earth, the heart is a tireless engine, pumping blood upward against the weight of the body. Each beat must overcome gravity to push oxygen to the brain, to send warmth to the hands, to fuel the long journey of blood returning from the feet. In a world of half gravity, that burden is cut in two. Arteries would not need such strong pressure, veins would not struggle as fiercely, and the heart itself might remain supple for longer. Lifespans could stretch not because of medicine, but because the simple mechanics of circulation are easier. A gentler world means a gentler demand on the pump that sustains us. Joints, too, would sigh with relief. Every step we take now grinds cartilage, presses bone against bone, slowly wearing away the scaffolding of our movement. In weaker gravity, each stride would fall softer. Knees, hips, spines, all would carry less weight. The arthritis that troubles so many in old age might be rare, delayed for decades, perhaps even forgotten as a major cause of decline. Backs would remain straighter, legs more limber, because the very act of living does not wear them down as harshly. But with this grace comes fragility. Lighter skeletons, delicate by design, would not endure accidents well. A fall from a tree, a stumble on stone, even a sudden blow could break bones that have grown too fine to resist. The balance of health would shift, less daily wear, but more risk from the unexpected. On this earth, survival would not depend so much on endurance as on caution. Entire cultures might evolve rituals and practices to protect against injury. Soft floors in homes, padded walkways, perhaps even clothing woven with support, not for comfort but for safety. Speculation allows us to see further. Imagine a species that lives longer on average, hearts and joints lasting well into what we would now call old age. Wrinkles still form, hair still whitens, but bodies remain more mobile, more resilient in the everyday tasks of living. Yet at the same time, every individual carries within them a fragility, a vulnerability to sudden accidents. The elderly might not stoop or limp as they do now, but they would live carefully, aware that their bones, while unbent by time, are still brittle. Childbirth, too, might change. Lighter bodies and taller frames could reshape the structure of pelvis and hips. Delivery might be easier in some ways. Less strain on the mother, less pressure on the child. But fragile skeletons in newborns could bring new risks, bones bending or breaking with ease in those first delicate moments. Medicine and tradition alike would evolve to cradle life more gently from the very beginning. The psychology of health would shift as well. On this earth, we admire strength, muscle, durability. On a lighter earth, perhaps we would admire grace, balance, and caution. A long life would not be earned by toughness, but by attentiveness, by avoiding the small slips that could bring disaster. A culture might grow in which every movement is measured, elegant, almost ritualistic, shaped not by the pursuit of power but by the need to preserve delicate bodies across many decades. And with longevity would come a different relationship to time. Imagine living not 70 or 80 years on average, but perhaps 100, 120, simply because the body is not worn down by constant pressure. Generations would overlap more deeply, elders guiding great-grandchildren, wisdom layering itself across centuries. Families might stretch taller in memory as well as in form, stories reaching further back because more years are lived and shared. But this gift of time would come with the shadow of fragility. A society of long-lived beings might be haunted by sudden losses. One misstep, one accident, could shatter a life that might otherwise have stretched far longer. The grief of such a world would not be the slow decline of age, but the sharp absence of lives cut short by chance. Perhaps this is the paradox of a half-gravity humanity, graceful, long-lived, elegant in form, yet forever vulnerable to the sharp edges of fate. Bodies built to last, but not to endure sudden blows. A species that moves through its world with beauty, but also with caution, knowing that its health is both stronger and more fragile than it has ever been before. If the human form would stretch into tall, fragile grace beneath weaker skies, then the rest of life would not remain untouched. Gravity is the quiet architect behind every living shape. It limits how large a creature can grow, how wide wings must spread, how bones are arranged to carry weight. On a half-gravity Earth, those limits would relax. The animal kingdom would not just look different, it would expand into forms that on our present Earth are impossible. Start with size. On the Earth, the heaviest land animals, like elephants, stand near the maximum that bone and muscle can support. Their frames are engineering marvels, balancing mass against the unyielding tug of gravity. But loosen that pull, and the ceiling lifts. Animals could grow to heights and weights that would crush them here, yet remain mobile, even agile, in a lighter world. Imagine herds of creatures taller than houses, their necks stretching like living towers, their legs long enough to stride across rivers without breaking stride. The concept of giant would no longer be rare, it would be ordinary. Insects, too, would change dramatically. Their bodies rely on simple oxygen diffusion through tiny tubes called tracheae, a system that caps their size on Earth today. In the age of the Carboniferous, when oxygen levels were higher, dragonflies the size of hawks once skimmed the skies. On a half-gravity Earth, with thinner air but far less burden of weight, their wings could spread wider, their bodies elongate, their buzzing flight fill the skies with swarms the size of small birds. A forest walk might be accompanied by butterflies as large as dinner plates and beetles that scuttle with the presence of small dogs. Birds would soar into even stranger extremes. With gravity halved, the cost of flight plummets. Wings could stretch to incredible spans, feathers shaped for gliding across entire continents. Imagine creatures larger than airplanes drifting effortlessly, riding winds that spiral higher into the thinner sky. Migration could take on planetary scales, flocks spanning thousands of kilometers without pause, their shadows passing over seas and deserts like living storms. Even predators of the sky might grow vast, with talons large enough to snatch creatures the size of cattle, lifting them into the air with ease. On the ground, predators would adapt to this new scale as well. Cats and wolves might evolve into titans, bodies long and lean, built not for brute wrestling but for bounding leaps and rapid chases across open plains. Hunts would become aerial ballets, with prey and predator alike leaping higher, running farther, fighting in 3 dimensions rather than 2. A single chase might carry animals up and over boulders, into trees, even across rivers, as gravity's softened pull allows every movement to extend further. Aquatic life would also expand in strange ways. Water already lightens the load of bodies, but weaker gravity would allow even larger ocean dwellers. Whales could grow longer than skyscrapers are tall, their bodies supported both by water and by the reduced drag of their own mass. Fish might grow wide, fan-shaped, drifting like floating tapestries through the seas. Coral reefs could host creatures so vast they resemble living ships, moving slowly across shallow waters, reshaped by half-gravity tides. Speculation lets us see an Earth filled with towering megafauna, forests alive with creatures whose heads brush the highest branches, plains thunderous with herds whose steps shake the ground, skies crowded with wings that blot out the sun. The scale of life itself would be exaggerated, as though every creature has been stretched upward, freed from the chains that once held it small. Yet even here, balance would whisper its reminders. Larger size brings slower growth, greater need for food, longer vulnerability in youth. Predators too would adapt, perhaps smaller and swifter to take advantage of lumbering giants. Life on a half-gravity Earth would not be only spectacle, but also risk, an ecosystem in constant flux, shaped by the same delicate fragility that touched human bodies. And perhaps the most striking vision is this. Walking across such a world, you would never feel alone. Creatures of enormous scale would tower around you, their movements slower, grander, like living mountains in motion. Insects would hum overhead, vast wings stirring the air. Birds would pass, so high above that they seem like drifting continents. It would be a world where the line between land and sky is blurred, where animals themselves become part of the landscape, shaping the very sense of scale by their presence. If animals would swell to fill the skies and the seas, then plants, the silent architects of the land, would answer gravity softening in their own way. Plants have always been limited not by ambition, but by weight. Wood can only hold so high before it buckles. Stems can only rise so far before they snap. On a half-gravity Earth, those limits fall away. The forests of such a world would not resemble anything we know today. Imagine walking beneath trees that rise not 30 or 40 meters, but hundreds. Trunks would soar like columns in some endless cathedral, their crowns vanishing into mist where the thin air brushes the upper sky. You would tilt your head back and see not the end of the canopy, but a green horizon overhead, layer upon layer of leaves stretched across altitudes, where on our Earth only mountains stand. These arboreal giants would define the landscape as skyscrapers, define a modern city, vertical markers of life visible from leagues away. Between these towers, vines would climb without restraint. On our world, their weight eventually drags them down, coiling them close to the trunks they cling to. In lighter gravity, they could rise almost endlessly, spiraling upward in ribbons of green that hang like banners in the air. Some might weave between trees, creating natural bridges high above the ground. Others might dangle downward, their tips brushing the forest floor, alive with flowers that bloom in sunlight scattered through the canopy far above. The forest floor itself would change. On Earth today, tall trees compete for light, and the ground beneath them is often dim. But in a half-gravity forest, with canopies lifted hundreds of meters overhead, the undergrowth might be brighter, filled with smaller plants that thrive in a long corridor of filtered sun. The very scale of vertical space would be magnified. Shrubs, ferns, mosses, and fungi could stack in layers, one world above another, an ecosystem in 3 dimensions. Speculation paints a forest unlike anything in our imagination, a place of green skyscrapers, where roots spread wide to balance their towering bodies, and trunks echo like hollow towers when struck by wind. Leaves themselves might grow to vast sizes, catching light with sails as broad as rooftops. Insects of enormous wingspan would drift among them, pollinators large enough to shake whole branches as they land. Birds, already giants in this lighter world, might weave their nests not in branches, but in the hollows of trunks large enough to shelter entire human villages. Not all plants would grow upward. Some would take advantage of weaker gravity to sprawl outward instead. Fragile stems could extend farther without snapping, covering entire plains in mats of green. Picture meadows where stalks stretch meters above the ground, yet bend gracefully in the wind, resilient because they bear so little weight. Even grasses could become monumental, each blade like a living banner, rolling in waves across fields that seem to breathe beneath the sky. And then there are flowers. Petals today are limited by their weight, too large, and they droop, collapse, or tear. On this earth, blossoms could expand into extraordinary displays. Gardens might be filled with flowers meters across, their colors visible from afar, attracting pollinators that themselves have grown vast. Fragrance would drift higher into the air, carried on breezes that spiral up through towering trunks and endless vines. Forests in such a world would also sound different. Wind moving through leaves hundreds of meters above would create deep, resonant murmurs, more like the hum of distant seas than the rustle we know. Rain would fall more slowly, dripping from canopy to canopy, a storm lasting hours as water trickled its long descent. The forest floor might be a place of constant drizzle, fed by rain that began its journey far above, a cycle of water that never fully ends. Speculative extremes suggest ecosystems stacked in layers, canopy creatures living entirely hundreds of meters in the air, never descending to the ground, mid-level dwellers moving among vines and bridges of vegetation, ground animals wandering in green twilight, listening to the constant rain from above. Entire civilizations of life could exist without ever touching soil, their worlds defined by height alone. Such landscapes would not only be beautiful, they would be disorienting. Walking into them, you might feel less like you are in a forest and more like you are at the bottom of an inverted ocean, with trunks as pillars, vines as currents, and leaves drifting like schools of fish far overhead. It would be a world where the ground is only one of many stages of life, and where the sky itself has been colonized by green. High above the green architecture of that lighter world, the air loosens its hold and drifts outward in slow silvery tears. Gravity no longer presses the atmosphere tight against the skin of the planet. It does not pack molecules so densely against mountains and seas. Instead, the sky swells in quiet layers, an immense lifted roof. You notice it first in your chest, the gentle stretch at the top of an inhale, the way each breath seems to drink less with more effort, as though you are forever standing on a high plateau, even when your feet rest at sea level. Your voice softens in this air. Words do not travel with the crisp reach you expect. They move like lantern light through mist, present but diffused, audible yet gentled by space. What holds the sky together changes. With weaker pull, the pressure near the ground abates. The column of air above each square meter weighs less than it does on the earth you know, and that single difference ripples through the weather like a tuning fork struck once and left to hum through every system. The lower atmosphere stretches taller. The troposphere, where weather is born, gains altitude like a lifted ceiling in some patient cathedral, and the drama of cloud and rain plays out on a stage that has doubled its height. The horizon is not merely a line, it is a layered amphitheater, rising and rising until blue thins to pearl, and pearl deepens into the dark ink of space. Light wears this change as a new costume. With fewer molecules to scatter it at ground level, the midday sky feels paler, sometimes more fragile, washed in soft hues rather than thick blue. Twilight lingers longer. Sunset becomes a ceremony that takes its time. Red and amber stretch across the lifted air, then lavender and violet melt upward as though someone has slowly drawn a brush from the rim of the world to the zenith. At night, the stars seem a touch nearer, their shimmer less muddied by air, and in the high latitude seasons, the aurora extends in taller curtains, climbing and wavering with the freedom of a banner let go in a long haul. You look up, and the sky does not end. It only grows finer. Clouds respond like dancers unbound by a heavy floor. Freed from the stern hand of stronger gravity, they rise higher and spread farther. The small cumulus tufts of your familiar summers transform into broad, slow-breathing continents of vapor. Anvils bloom miles above old limits and keep rising, their edges feathered and delicate. Entire families of clouds, low sheets, middle swaths, tall towers, stack into slow-moving cities floating overhead. They move with the patience of mountains, casting long soft shadows that drift across forests and plains for days at a time. To stand in a clearing and watch them is to watch the planet thinking. Not hurried thoughts, but long careful ones. Rain follows these new rules with grace. Droplets no longer yanked earthward by the usual force, fall more like beads through syrup than stones through air. A shower turns to a drift. Streets do not ring with the staccato of impact so much as murmur with the whisper of a million small pearls sliding through space. If you step outside in such weather and lift your hand, you can watch a drop meet your palm. No rush, only the inevitability of downward. Sometimes, in this thinness, a drop never arrives. It evaporates along the way, turning to invisible breath, and what you see streaming from the base of a cloud, virga, becomes a frequent sight. Veils of rain that never touch the ground, ghost water drawn back into air. Snow is changed even more. It does not tumble, it lingers. Flakes grow large like paper cutouts and drift sideways for minutes at a time, flipping and reorienting in the lightest currents. A snowfall can feel like a slow ballet that fills the day without urgency. Where you stand, it seems to hover. You might step between the flakes as if walking through a forest of quiet moving leaves. On still nights, diamond dust hangs above fields, minute crystals suspended for hours, catching the moon and returning it as a hush of glitter. Snowdrifts shape themselves with a sculptor's patience, edges crisp because the air will not slam them down. Wind, too, acquires a new temperament. The pressure differences that drive it still exist, warmth and cold, sea and land, day and night, but the thin lifted air offers less mass to move. Gusts foster long, steady currents rather than sudden punches. You can hear the difference in trees. Leaves do not clatter, they hush. Across deserts, dunes do not leap forward in abrupt avalanches. They walk, broad-backed and dignified, under the guidance of breezes that prefer persistence over violence. Along coasts, the sea breeze travels farther inland each afternoon, filling valleys with a tender invasion of salt and cool. In the tropics, storms respond to the new geometry of the sky. With less weight to hold them down, their convective towers stretch broader and higher, but they develop with an unhurried pace. What begins as a humid morning breath becomes a monumental engine by evening, a columned palace of thunderheads whose domes flatten against the boundary between weather and space, and then bleed upward past it, as if refusing any lid. Lightning travels elegantly in this world. The lower density offers less resistance, and so the electric reach extends in finer, more elaborate branches, luminous handwriting that scrolls across half the horizon. When thunder follows, it is deeper and rounder, a bowl resonating from far away rather than a crack and slam, like listening to drums through the walls of a neighboring room. Tropical cyclones change character most of all. They are not the fierce, tightly wound fists you know, but wide open hands turning slowly over warm seas. Their eyes can be vast, lakes of sky spanning hundreds of kilometers, while their bends sweep coastlines in long grey ribbons. The winds need not roar to do their work. They persist day after patient day, drawing vapor from the ocean and laying it down inland as a constant hush of rain. Floods on this earth do not always shout. They accumulate, rising by inches, reshaping marshes, redrawing deltas, saturating soils that rarely get to dry. You might wake to a storm and dine under the same storm and grow old to the same storm gently migrating north. The map of a season might be the map of one spinning cloud family, journeying between latitudes. Mid-latitude weather, those great clashes of warm and cold that define much of the temperate world, voices itself in longer sentences. Fronts stretch and sprawl. The boundaries between air masses become broad, inhabitable regions rather than sharp lines. A week-long drizzly twilight is common, a month of on and off mist not remarkable. The jet streams above still snake and meander, but their speed moderates, their undulations slow like the breathing of a sleeping animal. Storm tracks shift wider, often wandering in, loops that revisit the same place again and again, because nothing in this sky is in a hurry to leave. You look up at the map, and it looks back at you like a tight chart for clouds. At the poles, the slower fall of ice crystals, and the taller playground of the atmosphere-built winters that feel surreal. Snow banners, long horizontal streams ripped from ridge lines, hover in place like white flags that never tire of lifting. Hoarfrost climbs every surface at leisure, growing delicate cathedrals of ice from fence posts and spruce needles. In the heart of winter, a sundog can hold its station for hours, circling the sun with frozen fire as if pinned in place by a story that refuses to end. And when the thaw comes, it does not crash upon the land. It leans into it. Meltwater spreads quietly across tundra that has learned to expect slow conversations with spring. Mountains taller in this world tie the sky and ground more tightly together. Ridges that on your earth would scrape the ceiling of weather now pierce deep into it. On their windward faces, moist air is pulled upward through kilometers more of climb, and the clouds built by that lift become grand terraces, palaces upon palaces, stacked to heights that leave climbers moving through halls of vapor for days. On the leeward side, the air that descends warms and dries across a longer fall. Rain shadows become vast, delicately tuned deserts, quiet bowls where dust travels in stately sheets, and mirages dance for hours without shifting. To traverse such ranges is to wander in and out of seasons contained inside a single day. You climb into chill and thinness. You descend into heat and calm. Deserts under this sky are not silent emptiness, but subtle orchestras. Without dense air to swallow sound, the low notes of June song, those rare humming avalanches, carry farther in murmured bass. Dust devils grow tall and considerate, thin ropes that hold their form for miles, sketching calligraphy across flats of salt and pale clay. Rains, when they come, do not slam. They arrive as curtains of strands, and the smell of petrichor is not a sudden strike but a slow blooming. You can walk inside it for hours as the surface darkens, breath by breath. Once the sun returns, water remains suspended in air as a fine veil. Evaporative halos cling to rocks, shimmering pools of mirage tremble without vanishing, because the atmosphere cannot hurry their illusions away. In the tropics, where forests rise like cities, weather threads itself through green with a patient hand. Mists hold at mid-canopy through entire mornings, enrobing vines and buttress roots with lace. Epiphytes drink from air that does not want to fall. They reach their roots into the passing rather than the soil, and entire gardens bloom in the sky. When afternoon storms set their foundations, the first herald is not wind or shadow, but a softening of distance. The far canopy turns to watercolor, depth dissolving into gray-green, and then the first drops arrive like a quiet metronome. 1, then 5, then 1,000. No haste, only more. Pools rise not in minutes, but in long, visible ascents. The forest becomes a house filling a basin, and life shifts to its upper floors, while the ground enjoys a long drink. Coasts live by new rhythms. Sea breezes, able to travel farther inland through thin air, deliver maritime coolness to towns that on your earth would be heat-tight. Fogs can climb long distances up gentle hills, disassembling landscapes into layered silhouettes, a dark fishing boat close by, a paler headland farther on, a ghost of mountain beyond that. The line between ocean and sky blurs so completely at times that birds fly in a page with no margin. When storms meet shore, their surges, shaped also by low gravity's influence on water, arrive not as fists but as open hands that push and push without stopping. The air tastes of salt for weeks. Laundry hangs and never quite dries. Lighthouses hum a different note. If you listen carefully, you learn that sound itself has adopted the sky's patience. Church bells gain a velvet to their ring, as if wrapped in gauze. A violin under such air finds its high notes softened and its low notes widened. Flutes and whistles travel farther than shouts. The thinness favors certain timbres, and so music evolves to suit the medium. In some towns, voices pitch a little lower in winter, as the densest air of the year gives words back a portion of their crispness. In others, people build speaking places, courtyards, curving walls, wooden shells, that cradle the human voice and send it down alleys like a river. The atmosphere becomes architecture. Human habits shift around these longer moods of weather. Roofs learn to drink, curved and layered. They gather mist and drip steady threads into cisterns below. Streets welcome water instead of fighting it, with center troughs and slow gardens that accept a month of drizzle and return it as flowers. Clothing grows a vocabulary for air that seldom stands still. High collars for lingering chill. Fine mesh veils for pollen seasons that last and last, light capes that shed the soft enduring rains. Farmers plant with an eye not to downpours, but to tapestries of moisture. They tend orchards on terraces that keep the long trickle for weeks, and send runners up into the loaded clouds to collect. They learn to read the pale of the sky like a ledger of coming days. You, making tea by a window, come to measure time not by the hour, but by the posture of clouds. There are days when weather does startle. A burst of cold falls through thin air and creates ice from one valley to the next, while the next valley stays as it was. A downslope wind descends from a giant shoulder of mountain, compressed and warmed across such a long drop that it arrives like an invisible fire, sending the scent of pine resin into every street. A noctilucent veil glows high and unearthly at summer midnight, and you stand in the doorway bare, feet on cool stone, watching silver breath slip between constellations. But most of the time the sky is a long story told slowly. Paragraphs of mist, commas of drizzle, ellipses of thin sun drifting behind gauze. Even the machinery that sculpts climate, the great circulations that push heat toward the poles and bring cold home again, adapts to patience. Monsoons do not crash, they lean into their work, arriving like friends who stay long enough to know you. Trade winds keep their promises with fewer gusts and more constancy. Over warm seas, cloud streets, the tidy rows of cumulus that mark invisible lanes of rising air stretch for hundreds of kilometers, faithful as orchard rows, and pilots of that world learn to hop from street to street the way a sailor learns to tack by the wind. In all this, life learns new chores and new joys. Children chase snowflakes that hang within reach. Gardeners harvest dew at dawn from nets strung like harps between poles. Shepherds read the high veils of Cirrus as they would a calendar. This week will be soft. Next week will be softer still. In cities where fog loves the river, architects carve light wells through tall courts, so that even on the longest gray, the stone can remember what sun is like. On plateaus, observatories rise, not in lonely spires, but in villages of domes, for the lifted air gifts astronomers whole nights of unblinking clarity. They repay the gift by naming slow storms like constellations. Sometimes the sky becomes a teacher. You learn patience from a drizzle that will not stop. You learn humility from a cyclone that is a continent wide and uninterested in drama. You learn attention from the single gust that carries the scent of far forests to your door and then vanishes. And you learn that weather is not just an event, but a relationship between heat and cold, sea and land, cloud and leaf, river and roof, breath and breath, stretched out across a softer world, where nothing needs to hurry to be real, and just as the sky gentles water and sound and light, it reshapes the temper of flame and the labor of lungs. The next thought rises naturally from this one, how fire behaves when air is thin, and gravity asks less of every spark, and how every living chest learns to make do when fewer molecules come with each inhale. Under weaker gravity, fire, the most ancient tool of civilization, would become something unfamiliar, something both more beautiful and more treacherous. On our earth, flames rise quickly, narrow tongues of light, pulled upward by convection, fed by oxygen at a pace set by gravity's hand. But half that pull and the dance of fire changes. Flames would stretch taller, their edges blurred, rising slowly as if reluctant to let go of the ground. A campfire would not flicker in tight curls, but billow upward in elongated ghostly sheets, its motion slowed into a hypnotic sway. The physics behind it lies in convection. Hot air rises because it is lighter, cooler air sinks to take its place, and gravity accelerates this exchange. Weaker gravity means slower circulation, which means fire spreads with less urgency. A burning log might smolder for hours before bursting into flame, and once alight, its fire would climb in lazy plumes, less a flicker and more a slow bloom of light. Imagine torches carried through ancient cities, not quick flames casting sharp shadows, but tall soft pillars glowing like lanterns, illuminating streets with a gentler, eerie brilliance. But with thinner air, oxygen itself becomes a scarce commodity. Breathing would be harder, lungs straining to draw in fewer molecules with each breath. Fire, too, would gasp for fuel. A hearth might need constant tending to keep alive, and in some places, flames might fail to catch at all. Civilizations built in such a world would wage a constant battle with their own atmosphere, stoking fires, cultivating oxygen-rich spaces, perhaps even breeding forests not only for timber and shade, but as guardians of breath itself. Picture great cities with oxygen gardens at their hearts, groves of trees rising in sacred courtyards, tended as carefully as temples, their leaves the quiet machinery keeping the city alive. Festivals of fire might take on religious weight, not for their warmth or light alone, but because each spark is hard won, each blaze a reminder of fragility. Priests and scientists alike might learn to coax flames with mixtures of plant oils and powdered minerals, creating fire that burns higher or longer in a world that resists it. And what of daily life? Cooking, heating, forging metal. Each would carry more effort, more risk. Blacksmiths might wield bellows of monumental scale, pumping air with whole teams of apprentices just to keep a furnace alive. In colder climates, the struggle to hold flame against thin air might shape migration, trade, even survival. Villages would rise where air pools thicker, in valleys or near seas, places where oxygen lingers more generously than on bare plateaus. Speculation takes us further still. Imagine civilizations that learn to carry fire not in sparks or embers, but in sealed vessels of compressed air, little globes of oxygen-fed flame that glow like bottled suns. Firefighters might not battle flames with water, but with blankets of heavy gases, smothering them in ways suited to a sky already thin. And cultures might mythologize the act of breathing itself, songs praising lungs that draw deep, stories of gods who exhale storms to gift their children air enough to live. But fragility would always remain. A single fall could shatter bones, and a single misstep could starve a fire. On this half-gravity earth, flame and breath alike would be precious, rare forces wrested from a reluctant sky. A civilization defined by its lightness would forever live in negotiation with its own atmosphere, building rituals, technologies, and philosophies around the simple sacred acts of breathing and burning. Would you like me to expand this section even further by weaving in myth, cultural practices, and speculative technologies tied to fire and oxygen, so it mirrors the length and depth of the rewritten atmosphere and weather section? The oceans are Earth's great mirrors, vast bodies that answer directly to gravity's call. Their tides, their waves, their ceaseless motion are sculpted not only by wind and moonlight, but by the invisible hand that pulls every molecule of water toward the planet's heart. If that hand were softened, if Earth's gravity were halved, then every sea, every river, every raindrop gathered in the lowlands would move in unfamiliar ways. Begin with the tides. On our present Earth, the gravitational tug-of-war between planet and moon pulls the oceans into bulges that rise and fall each day, waves of liquid sculpted by the heavens. With gravity weakened, those same lunar pulls would exert greater relative force, drawing tides much higher, pushing them farther inland, spilling seas across coasts and swells that would drown the familiar line between land and water. Imagine shorelines that do not simply shift by meters, but by kilometers, cities and forests swept rhythmically by an ocean that arrives like a living tide creature, reclaiming the land twice a day, and the waves themselves, without strong gravity to drag them down, each swell would rise taller, linger longer, crash slower. A storm at sea would no longer whip up short, sharp crests, but instead conjure massive rolling hills of water that take hours to fall. To sail across such seas would be to climb and descend moving landscapes, the horizon rising and falling like a heartbeat of liquid mountains. Entire fleets might vanish into the trough of a single wave, only to reappear minutes later on its crest, sails glowing in sunlight as if lifted into the sky itself. Rivers would not escape this change. Gravity is the architect of a river's pace, the force that drives it downhill, carving valleys, shaping deltas. On a half-gravity Earth, rivers would slow, their journeys drawn out across the land. Their currents would spread wide, meandering in vast braids, wandering across floodplains that never fully dry. A single river might not cut a sharp gorge, but instead expand into a web of waterways, tens of kilometers across, flowing so gently that forests and villages would exist as islands within them. In spring, floods would not surge and recede in days. They would rise gradually, linger for weeks, then withdraw with patient reluctance, leaving behind whole new landscapes drawn in water. Speculative visions suggest coasts in constant flux, sculpted not over centuries but in seasons. Half-gravity oceans would be restless, their waters sloshing higher and wider, battering cliffs with slower but more immense blows. Caves carved by the sea might stretch deep into the land, channels tunneling beneath headlands, echoing with the slow boom of waves that take minutes to crest and minutes more to collapse. Beaches would not be narrow strips but wide shallow plains, tide-washed for leagues, sparkling under the sun like sheets of liquid glass. Life itself would adapt. Fish might evolve to ride the long, slow lifts of half-gravity waves, bodies shaped not for speed but for endurance in rolling swells. Coastal plants could root across tidal zones that extend for miles, their leaves salted twice daily, their trunks adapted to shifting waters. Birds might learn to nest on floating rafts of vegetation, traveling with the tides rather than resisting them. For humans, such seas would be both gift and peril. Travel by ship might become easier in one sense, currents slower, waves less violent, but more dangerous in another, with tides capable of swallowing harbors, carrying vessels deep inland, then abandoning them on plains of sand. Coastal societies might learn to build cities on stilts or floating platforms, designed to rise and fall with the water. Ports would not be fixed places but mobile harbors, tethered to anchor stones that shift with each tide. In mythology, oceans might be revered as restless giants, their reach feared and honored in equal measure. Tides would not be minor events but daily cataclysms, rituals of advance and retreat that redefine the shape of the world. Myths could tell of gods who breathe in and out, dragging the sea with each inhalation and exhalation, reminding mortals that land itself is temporary, only alone between floods. And yet, in the slow rhythms of these waters, there would be beauty. Picture standing on a half-gravity coast at sunset, watching a wave rise silently against the horizon. It swells for minutes, golden light catching its crest, until it stands like a liquid wall, hundreds of meters high, shimmering with the reflection of clouds. Then, with equal patience, it bends, collapsing not with a crash but with a long drawn-out sigh, pouring itself across a plain of sand, leaving tide pools deep enough to drown forests in miniature. A lighter Earth would be a planet where water never rests, where seas are sculptors of continents, where rivers refuse boundaries, where tides are daily reminders that even land is not fixed, but a fleeting shape borrowed from the ocean. To live on such shores would be to live with humility, to accept that permanence is an illusion, and that the world itself breathes in tides as vast and fragile as the air above. If the oceans of a half-gravity Earth never rest, then the cold places of this world, its glaciers, its ice caps, its drifting snow, would be no less transformed. For ice is water slowed, sculpted not by waves and tides, but by stillness, by pressure, by the patient work of gravity over millennia. When that pull weakens, the very geometry of ice changes. Start with the polar ice sheets. On our Earth, they spread outward under their own weight, creeping slowly toward the sea, pressed and cracked by the gravity that drags them down. But under weaker gravity, that downward pressure is reduced. The ice no longer flows as easily. Instead, it can stack higher, grow taller, rise into jagged cliffs and crystalline walls that stretch into the sky like frozen mountain ranges. From a distance, the poles might look less like flat expanses of white and more like forests of glassy towers, blue-white spires catching the sun and throwing it in cold brilliance across the horizon. Yet this added height brings fragility. Without strong compression, ice bonds less firmly. Crevasses gape wide, ridges split into delicate arches, and entire shelves could carve away, with a sound that rolls for miles, a cathedral of ice collapsing into the sea in slow motion. The seas themselves, already restless, would receive these fragments with a shudder, scattering icebergs the size of cities into ocean currents that carry them across half the world. Shipping in such a world would be forever at risk, for the waters would not only rise and fall with immense tides, but also bristle with frozen monoliths, adrift like wandering fortresses. Snow, too, would take on new character. On our Earth, flakes tumble quickly, guided by gravity's steady hand, striking ground with quiet finality. In half-gravity, each flake would linger in the air, descending slowly, drifting sideways at the faintest breeze. A snowfall would not be a fleeting veil, but a drawn-out spectacle. Imagine looking up and seeing the sky filled with vast, intricate flakes, some as large as your palm, falling so patiently that they seem suspended, hanging in air like delicate ornaments. Walking through such snow would feel like moving through a dreamscape, the silence deeper, the air alive with frozen lace that refuses to hurry. Blizzards would not rage in flurries, but in endless curtains, snow suspended for hours, even days. A storm might begin in the morning and continue into the night, but instead of the white-out walls of snow, it would be a world where flakes glide slowly past your vision, never chaotic, always graceful. In the aftermath, drifts would be higher, softer, and less compacted. To step into them would be to sink deeper than expected, swallowed by snow that has fallen without pressure, a powder so light that it gives way beneath every footfall. Seasons would stretch into new shapes. Winters might last longer, their transitions slower. Spring thaw would be less violent, rivers swelling not in sudden floods, but in prolonged pulses, meadows flooding quietly as meltwater refuses to rush. Summers might linger cooler at high latitudes, because the great walls of ice take centuries to melt, reflecting sunlight back into the sky like colossal mirrors. Climate itself could oscillate more dramatically. Warm periods inviting seas to rise far inland, cold periods locking water into frozen towers that dominate the poles like silent guardians. Speculative extremes imagine entire civilizations reshaped by these winters. Villages might be buried beneath long drifts, their roofs poking out like islands. Travel could shift skyward, bridges and towers built above the snowfields, while ground-level paths are abandoned for months at a time. Architecture would adapt with steep high roofs that shed snow like water, and with long tunnels cut through ice, glowing blue in winter sunlight. Children would grow up in worlds where play is a dance through weightless flakes, leaping into drifts so light they billow like clouds. But fragility again lingers. The great ice cliffs, though taller, would be prone to collapse. Avalanches would fall slower, but spread farther, sweeping across valleys in waves of snow that move with the patience of tides, yet bury everything in their path. Climbers who scale frozen towers would find themselves in landscapes where stability cannot be trusted, where a wall that stands for centuries might one day sigh, shift, and fall without warning. Legends would surely follow. In such a world, winter would not be seen as merely a season, but as a power in its own right, a force of patience, beauty, and danger. Myths might tell of sky spirits who weave endless snow, of gods who raise icy spires to mark the boundaries of their realms. Snowflakes falling slow enough to study as they drift would be seen as sacred symbols, messages written in frozen geometry. To live in these climates would be to live in surreal beauty. Nights lit by moons reflecting off towering ice, days filled with skies of drifting white, seasons sculpted by glaciers that reach into the clouds. A half-gravity Earth would not simply be colder or warmer, it would be stranger, its climate stretched into dreamlike extremes, where snow hangs in air like time itself suspended, and where ice builds monuments too delicate to last. Where the land and the climate reshape themselves in answer to a lighter pull, so too would the work of human hands. Architecture has always been an act of negotiation with gravity. Every stone lifted, every arch balanced, every beam supported, is a silent conversation with the force that wants it to fall. On our earth, that dialogue sets limits. Towers collapse if they climb too high. Bridges buckle if their spans stretch too far. Domes must thicken to carry their own weight. But in a world of half-gravity, those limits loosen. Human ambition, already restless, would find new wings. Imagine a city where the skyline is not constrained by the load-bearing strength of stone or steel. In half-gravity, the weight pressing downward on every beam is cut in two. Walls can be thinner, supports lighter, foundations less massive. A builder can reach upward with confidence, stacking floors upon floors, until skyscrapers rise not just hundreds of meters, but kilometers into the air. Towers might pierce through clouds and anchor themselves above storms, their windows looking out across seas of mist. The skyline would resemble a forest of spires, each one stretching toward the heavens, slender as reeds but strong enough in this lighter world to stand unmoved. And it would not only be height that changes. Bridges could span entire valleys, light as lace stretched across the landscape. Arches might curve across rivers with no piers, vaulting freely for kilometers before touching earth again. Roofs, once limited by their own mass, could sweep upward in broad, delicate canopies, resembling the wings of vast birds. Cathedrals might grow not heavy and solemn, but tall and airy, their steeples so high they seem like fingers touching the edge of the sky. Speculation suggests that entire cities could reorganize themselves vertically. Where our civilization spread outward, consuming land, these might rise upward, stacked into tiers. The lowest levels could be filled with markets and farms, higher layers with homes, and the uppermost crowns with observatories and gardens suspended above the clouds. Elevators, powered by simple counterweights, would travel kilometers without difficulty. To live in such a city would be to live inside a mountain of glass and steel, its summit brushing the thin air of the upper atmosphere. Construction methods themselves would evolve. Builders would discover that lighter loads allow for more daring experiments. Materials that would crumble under their own weight on our Earth could now form viable structures. Clay, wood, even glass could rise higher than stone towers ever could here. Cities might shimmer with translucent walls, glowing softly as the sun sets behind them. Entire districts could be built as spiraling towers, their floors turning slowly around a central shaft, offering each dwelling a rotating view of land and sky. But fragility would remain an ever-present theme. These soaring towers, though stable in weaker gravity, would be vulnerable to storms that stretch higher and linger longer. A single lightning strike in the upper atmosphere could travel through entire spires, and winds unbroken by friction at such altitudes could sway their tops like trees. Builders would learn to tether towers together, linking spires with bridges and walkways until cities resembled webs of light suspended in air. Cultural identity would follow. Architecture is never just shelter. It is philosophy carved into form. On a half-gravity Earth, buildings would express humanity's new relationship with the sky. No longer pressed close to the ground, people would come to see height as natural, even sacred. Myths would grow of ancestors who dwelled in the heavens, of gods who taught humanity to climb toward the stars. Religious shrines might be built at the highest levels of towers, so that prayers rise literally closer to the heavens. Practical needs would also reshape design. Thin air at higher altitudes would require sealed chambers, gardens of oxygen-producing plants, and systems of air circulation that bring the breath of the lower world upward. Windows might be smaller at great heights, not to block weight, but to preserve air. Farms might be built in vertical layers, crops stacked upward in hydroponic spirals, nourished by slow rivers lifted through the city by pumps and channels. At night, these gardens could glow with bioluminescent plants, bred for light as much as food, casting cities in a soft living radiance. Speculative extremes reach further still. Imagine a world where entire communities live not on land, but suspended. Vast platforms anchored to mountaintops, floating gardens tethered above plains, towers that rise so high their summits vanish into permanent fog. People might travel between them not by road but by air, soaring on gliders that require only minimal effort to stay aloft in half-gravity, weaving between spires like birds through a forest. And in such cities, the very sense of scale would alter human consciousness. Streets would not be corridors pressed between heavy walls, but airy promenades open to the sky. Markets might occupy bridges stretched hundreds of meters above the ground, where merchants sell their goods against the backdrop of drifting clouds. Homes could be carved into the sides of towers, their windows looking out not at neighbors, but at horizons. To step outside would be to step into height itself. In half-gravity, architecture becomes not a battle against collapse, but an art of ascent. It is no longer about resisting weight, but about embracing lightness. The result is a civilization that does not simply build on the earth, but builds into the sky, spires and bridges and towers rising until cities themselves resemble constellations anchored to the ground. Once humanity has learned to build upward, the next frontier is motion, how to move through a world where gravity is less insistent, less demanding of energy with every step, every flight, every launch into the void. In half-gravity, the very act of travel would be transformed. Machines would need less power, animals and people would carry themselves farther with less effort, and the dreams of leaving Earth's embrace would become not distant possibilities, but everyday realities. Take first to the skies. On our present Earth, airplanes must fight to lift themselves, their wings straining to hold tons of weight aloft against gravity's pull. Engines roar, burning fuel in rivers just to maintain altitude. But on a half-gravity Earth, flight becomes not a battle, but a glide. Wings, needing to support less weight, could be thinner, lighter, and longer. Engines could shrink to half their size and still carry vast loads. An aircraft designed here might barely need thrust at all, merely a shove into the air, after which it would soar for hours, riding thermals and currents in skies that linger high above the ground. Passenger planes might resemble sleek gliders, lifting gently from city spires, drifting over continents like floating lanterns. Even personal flight becomes plausible, the weight of the human body halved, the power required to lift it cut dramatically. A person might strap on wings of fabric and metal, leap from a rooftop and glide for kilometers before touching down. Early inventors could have taken to the skies centuries before the Wright brothers. Civilizations might have evolved entire traditions of personal flight. Sky festivals, where people leap from towers in colorful wingsuits, markets where artisans sell handcrafted gliders as casually as shoemakers once sold sandals. But the transformation does not end with the air. Travel across land also shifts. Carts, wagons, and eventually vehicles would need less fuel to carry goods. Roads could climb steeper hills, bridges could stretch lighter spans, and the very idea of terrain as a barrier would soften. Trains would use half the energy to crest mountains. Horses or other beasts of burden could run farther without tiring, carrying loads that, in this lighter world, seem almost effortless. Most profound of all is the doorway to space. On Earth today, rockets demand towering engines, oceans of fuel, and the precision of thousands to escape gravity's grasp. Half that pull, and the math changes. A rocket needs not millions of pounds of thrust, but half as much. Its tanks need not be skyscrapers, but towers. Entire programs of exploration could begin centuries earlier. Where our world waited until the 20th century to touch the stars, a half-gravity Earth might have launched its first astronauts during the Renaissance. Imagine Leonardo da Vinci not sketching wings, but standing on the shores of the Mediterranean, watching a slender rocket rise toward the moon, its plume glowing faintly against the night. And with earlier exploration comes earlier expansion. Space stations might circle this lighter Earth, not in our time, but in the age of steam. Colonies on the Moon, or even Mars, could be centuries old, their histories as long and intricate as any nation's on Earth. Children might grow up knowing the sky is not a limit, but a highway, traveled as easily as a ship crosses seas. Myths themselves would shift, the heavens no longer an unreachable realm of gods, but a neighborhood of worlds awaiting exploration. Speculative extremes envision civilizations shaped around this ease of travel. Cities built in spires would be linked not by roads but by air lanes, corridors of gliders, airships, and small craft weaving between towers. Entire continents could be crossed in silence by fleets of sail-driven aircraft, riding high currents in thin air. Nations might rise not around rivers or fertile valleys, but around the control of flight paths and spaceports. Wars, too, would change, fought less on the ground and more in the skies, or even beyond the atmosphere, as nations seized the advantage of half-gravity rocketry. Everyday life would follow suit. Families might own personal gliders the way we own bicycles, children learning to leap from rooftop gardens into the air as naturally as they learn to walk. Merchants might send goods not by ship or caravan, but by air, caravans of cargo, gliders drifting along steady winds. Explorers might chart not rivers or mountains, but high-altitude currents, discovering trade winds that circle the globe like invisible highways. Travel and technology on such a world would not merely expand possibility, they would redefine what it means to be human. In a lighter world, flight is not a rare achievement, but a daily experience. Space is not a distant frontier, but an extension of home. Technology itself would carry less of the weight of struggle, more of the grace of imagination. In half gravity, movement becomes freedom. Humanity, unshackled from Earth's heavy pull, would rise into the skies, across continents, and eventually into the stars. When bodies grow tall and light, when travel itself becomes a dance through air and sky, the games we play and the cultures we shape cannot remain the same. Sport has always been a mirror of our physical limits. Wrestling, born of strength, running born of endurance, ball games born of gravity's pull and rebound. But on a half-gravity Earth, where leaps are longer, where falls are gentler, and where the sky is never far from reach, sport would be transformed into something that looks to us like magic. Children would discover their abilities first. A game of tag would no longer be confined to the ground. It would leap across rooftops, bound from tree to tree, glide across slow-falling rain. A child's laughter would carry not just horizontally, but vertically, as they chase each other into branches and towers, darting between levels of a city designed with height in mind. Parents would not scold them for climbing too high. They would teach them to fall well, to twist in air, to land with grace. Acrobatics would become as ordinary as walking, balance and agility, replacing raw speed as the core of play. Formal sport would evolve accordingly. Imagine stadiums built not as ovals of track or rectangles of turf, but as vertical arenas, vast columns with platforms at different heights, where athletes compete to perform the longest leaps, the most intricate flips, the most daring aerial passes of a ball. Whole teams might rise through levels of air, tossing objects that hang longer before falling, executing strategies not in 2 dimensions, but in 3. The boundaries of play would stretch upward, and spectators would crane their necks to follow athletes soaring above them like birds at festival. New sports would arise, shaped by this altered relationship with the ground. Sky dancing might become the most revered of all, a blend of gymnastics, acrobatics, and ritual, where performers leap into choreographed formations, weaving through air in patterns that resemble constellations. Entire cultures could gather for festivals of lightness, watching hundreds of dancers launch themselves from platforms into choreographed mid-air spirals, illuminated by lanterns or bioluminescent fabrics that paint glowing arcs against the night sky. The very rhythm of traditional games would change. In half-gravity, balls thrown or kicked would travel farther and stay aloft longer. A simple act of passing could become a tactical choice. Do you send the ball arcing high into the air, giving your teammates time to leap and intercept, or do you skim it low, where speed still dominates? Sports like basketball would not end at 10-foot hoops. They would rise to goals, suspended stories above the ground, requiring not only skill but the courage to leap into open air to score. And combat sports, our oldest echoes of survival, would be transformed into aerial duels. Wrestling would shift into grappling mid-leap, fighters twisting in slow arcs, their contests as much about who can land safely as who can strike hardest. Martial arts would evolve not around blocks and strikes, but around control of the body in air, kicks that send opponents tumbling meters backward, throws that cast them into graceful, helpless flight. Spectators would cheer not for brute force, but for precision, control, and elegance of motion. Beyond sport lies culture itself. Art would be shaped by this ease of ascent. Dancers would no longer confine themselves to stages. Performances might take place in open plazas, with artists leaping from platforms, spinning through suspended veils of fabric, creating living sculptures against the backdrop of sky. Festivals would become carnivals of flight, whole communities adorning themselves in wings of silk, leaping in coordinated patterns above their cities, creating rivers of color that drift and intertwine like the auroras overhead. Religion, too, would weave these movements into ritual. In temples built high into spires, worshippers might ascend not by stair but by leap, each bound a symbolic offering of effort toward the heavens. Priests might mark holy days with mass sky dances, congregations leaping in unison, their collective weight momentarily lifted, a whole people rising and falling like waves of devotion. Speculative divisions suggest even language itself might adapt. Words for walking and running would fade in importance, replaced by a rich vocabulary for leaps, arcs, glides, and landings. Poetry would describe not the endurance of journeys, but the elegance of ascents. Proverbs might remind children, it is not how high you leap, but how gracefully you land. Entire philosophies would grow around the metaphor of lightness, the idea that to be human is not to endure weight, but to embrace air, to live in harmony with the upward pull of possibility. In such a culture, stories would be filled with skyborn heroes. Folk tales might speak of figures who leapt into the heavens to steal fire from the stars, or lovers who crossed entire valleys in single strides to meet beneath the moon. Even architecture would celebrate this mythos with open courtyards designed not for gatherings on the ground, but for leaps above it, the sky itself becoming the stage for human expression. All of it, play, ritual, art, and myth, would converge on a single truth. In half-gravity, culture itself would be built around the sky. Humanity would not simply live on Earth, it would live between earth and air, every game and every dance a rehearsal for the freedom of flight. If culture and play become rehearsals for flight, then philosophy becomes its reflection, the deeper story a civilization tells itself about what it means to live in a world where heaviness is not the default. On our Earth, weight is constant. It presses us into the ground, defines our endurance, shapes our metaphors. We speak of heavy burdens, of gravity as seriousness, of falling as failure. But in a half-gravity Earth, where every leap is longer and every load is lighter, the very symbolism of weight would transform. Here, gravity would not be seen as an oppressor, but as a gentle companion, a tether that holds, but does not restrain. Philosophers might write not of struggle against the pull of the earth, but of gratitude for its softness. To exist in such a world is to be half free, half held, suspended between ground and sky. And so the human story might not be about overcoming heaviness, but about embracing airiness, finding balance in lightness, seeing beauty not in endurance but in release. Myths would grow from this perception. Instead of tales of giants chained to the earth, stories might tell of skyborn ancestors, beings who descended not from the soil but from the air itself, who touched the ground only to cultivate it before returning to their true home among the clouds. Religious traditions could center not on burial within the earth, but on ascent toward the heavens, funerary rites where bodies are carried to great heights and released, symbolically returning the spirit to the air. Temples themselves would reflect this worldview. Shrines might be built high in towers, requiring worshippers to leap or climb toward them, acts of devotion expressed through the bodily ascent. Ritual dances, already woven into culture, would become prayers of lightness, group leaps meant to embody the upward striving of the human spirit. Sacred texts might teach that to rise is to live, that heaviness is not a punishment but a state of forgetting, and that true wisdom lies in remembering our kinship with the sky. Even ethics could bend toward this philosophy. Where our earth often values stability, permanence, and strength, a half-gravity world might prize adaptability, lightness of being, the ability to move with grace through changing circumstances. The ideal person would not be described as grounded, but as lifted, a soul capable of leaping beyond sorrow, floating above anger, rising above conflict. To be weighed down might be seen as a flaw, while to be light of heart, light of step, light of thought would be praised as virtues. Speculation extends into the realm of cosmology. Thinkers might imagine that the soul itself is not bound by mass, but is a breath, a rising spark destined to drift upward into the infinite. Entire religions could emerge around the worship of air, breath, and sky. Gods would be imagined not as lords of mountains or seas, but as great beings of wind and cloud, their voices carried in thunder, their laughter in breezes, their tears in rain. Pilgrimages might lead not to distant lands, but to great heights, mountain peaks, cloud-wrapped towers, floating temples suspended by balloons or gliders, tethered to the earth below. Philosophical schools might divide themselves by how they interpret lightness. One might see it as freedom, the invitation to transcend suffering by rising above it. Another might warn that lightness is fragility, that to be too unbound is to risk breaking when storms arrive. A third might teach that balance lies between the two, that humans are meant to live between earth and sky, grounded enough to endure, lifted enough to dream. Such debates would shape literature, art, and politics, creating societies that argue not about strength or weakness, but about what it means to live with half a tether. Language itself would reveal the shift. Where we speak of being weighed down, they might speak of being pulled too hard. Where we speak of falling in love, they might speak of rising in love, of souls lifting together. Laughter could be described as a kind of lightness in the chest, sorrow as a heaviness that drags one too close to the ground. Over centuries, entire cultures might forget that heaviness was ever a metaphor for seriousness at all, replacing it instead with imagery of ascent, buoyancy, and grace. Speculative visions of religion complete this picture. Festivals of air might mark the year, where communities gather on high platforms and release thousands of glowing lanterns into the sky, each symbolizing a prayer, a soul, or a wish. The sight of them rising together into the night would be not just beautiful but sacred, a reaffirmation of their collective belief that life itself is meant to ascend. In myths told to children, heroes might not slay dragons in caves but instead wrestle with winds, learning to ride them as companions. The afterlife might not be imagined underground, but in endless skies, a realm of perpetual dawn where spirits leap freely forever. In such a philosophy, humanity itself is redefined. We are not beings bound to the earth, struggling against weight. We are creatures of balance, born between two realms. Our destiny is not to endure the heaviness of the ground, but to learn the art of living lightly, gracefully, fleetingly, like the snow that drifts, the flame that lingers, the bird that glides. Here philosophy softens the meaning of gravity, war reveals its harshest truths, for in every world, conflict bends technology and imagination toward violence, and in a half-gravity Earth, warfare would be no less reshaped than sport, culture, or architecture. Here the battlefield would stretch not only across the land but into the air, combat, unfolding in vertical layers of movement, projectiles, and strategy. The simplest change comes with range. Weapons that hurl or launch projectiles, arrows, spears, stones, bolts from catapults, would travel far greater distances. An arrow loosed from a bow would not arc swiftly into the ground, but sail high and long, whistling across valleys, reaching targets thought unreachable in our world. Catapults, once confined to hurling stones a few hundred meters, could fling their loads kilometers, shattering walls, or raining fire from horizons away. Even the earliest armies would learn that half-gravity grants reach, and with it the chance to strike from safety. But the true transformation lies in the soldier's body. On our earth, a wall is a fortress, a sheer obstacle that requires ladders, siege towers, or months of attrition. On a lighter earth, walls lose much of their finality. Soldiers could leap them with practiced ease, vaulting upward in coordinated waves, striking defenders not from below but from above. Battles would not only be fought across open fields, but up the sides of towers, onto rooftops, along cliff faces. The vertical becomes as much a theater of war as the horizontal. Speculative visions of ancient warfare reflect this. Imagine Greek hoplites or Roman legions not in tight ground-bound formations, but in layered ranks, the first striking forward, the second leaping above, raining spears or darts downward upon their foes. Imagine knights not bound to horses but trained in aerial duels, swords flashing mid-leap as two combatants clash and then drift apart, each maneuver a mixture of grace and brutality. Fortifications would adapt. Castles would rise taller, their towers built not only for defense but as launch points for counterattacks. Walls would be crowned with archers who can shoot farther than ever before, while moats would widen into lakes designed not to deter siege engines, but to swallow soldiers who leap poorly. Defenders would use nets, weighted chains, or even giant sails to catch or hinder enemies who attack from above. Technology itself would accelerate under this pressure. Ballistas and trebuchets would fling not only stones but incendiary devices, their arcs tracing elegant paths across the sky before crashing into cities far away. Gunpowder weapons, once invented, would seem almost godlike. Bullets and cannonballs traveling vast distances, their destructive force magnified by air that offers less resistance. Musketeers could stand at great range and still strike, and artillery duels might span entire horizons, transforming landscapes into smoking cratered plains. Yet war is never only about tools, it is about adaptation. Soldiers trained in such a world would be acrobats as much as warriors, skilled not only in fighting but in controlling their bodies mid-flight. Martial traditions would evolve into schools of aerial combat, techniques for striking while rising, for grappling mid-air, for twisting to land safely after a fall. Armies would look less like ground-bound formations and more like swarms, flaring upward and downward, scattering and reforming, their movement patterns as fluid as the flocks of birds they would come to resemble. Speculative extremes show us entire strategies reshaped. Ambushes could come from above, with troops concealed in the treetops or clinging to cliff faces, dropping into enemy lines in coordinated waves. Cavalry might give way to sky infantry, soldiers who leap in disciplined rhythms, covering ground at speeds that rival mounted units. Even naval warfare would transform as boarding actions turn into chaotic aerial melees above swaying decks, sailors leaping from ship to ship like predators crossing drifting ice. But with such freedom comes fragility. Weapons that fly farther also wound more easily. Bodies lighter and bones more brittle mean that a single strike could be devastating. A spear hurled from above could pierce not only armor but bone with little resistance. A fall from height, though slower, would still shatter fragile skeletons. Armies might become terrifyingly lethal, yet shockingly fragile. Battles ending in decisive moments rather than drawn-out struggles. Cultural memory of these wars would linger. Songs would tell not of sieges that lasted months, but of battles that lasted minutes, decided in a storm of arrows that darkened the sky, or a single leap of warriors over walls thought unconquerable. Epic poems might describe heroes who soared higher than any soldier before them, striking with such elegance that their movements became legend. And myths, once again, would follow. War gods might be depicted not as armored brutes, but as winged figures, dancers of destruction, whose every leap shapes the fate of nations. In art, the battlefield would be painted not as a line of clashing armies, but as a layered storm of bodies and weapons, a chaos both beautiful and terrible, the ground and sky blurred into one arena of death. Half-gravity does not erase violence, it magnifies it into new dimensions, turning war into something fought not only across fields and walls, but through air itself. Aeriality, once the gift of birds, becomes the currency of armies, and with it, the very shape of conflict is forever rewritten. If battles in a half-gravity world unfold upward as well as outward, then the shape of defense must rise to meet them. On our earth, fortifications anchor themselves to the ground. Thick walls, deep moats, stone keeps, all designed to resist the weight of siege and the brute force of attackers. But in a world where soldiers can leap walls, where projectiles travel farther, and where verticality defines combat, defense becomes less about enduring force and more about commanding height. Fortresses would not sprawl across plains. They would cling to cliffs, crowning mountains like crowns of stone and steel. The higher the foundation, the greater the advantage, for every leap upward demands energy, and defenders perched above gain endless opportunities to strike downward. Cities might be built into sheer rock faces, their streets stacked vertically, each level a barrier, each terrace a line of defense. Attackers would face not only walls, but layers of elevation, each one defended by archers who can send arrows arcing across entire valleys. Towers, too, would dominate the landscape. In weaker gravity, these structures could rise to impossible heights, their foundations lightened, their materials freed from the crushing weight they bear on our earth. Defensive towers might climb kilometers, ringed with platforms for artillery, their tops bristling with engines that rain destruction across whole regions. A single fortress could serve as both castle and city, its base feeding farms and workshops, its summit a military bastion commanding the horizon. Moats would transform into lakes, widened not merely to slow siege engines, but to hinder the leaps of attackers. A soldier may leap a wall, but can they leap a body of water hundreds of meters wide? Defenders would use water as a barrier, shaping entire rivers to gird their strongholds. Bridges might be retractable or suspended high above ground, accessible only to those who can fly or who are permitted passage. Speculative visions stretch even further. Imagine fortresses suspended like hives from cliff faces, their entrances accessible only by leaps or glides. Armies attempting to conquer them would have to fight upward through layers of traps, nets strung across air, weighted chains hurled downward, even sails designed to catch and drag leaping attackers back to earth. Siege itself would no longer be about ramps and towers, but about patience, starving a city until it yields, because storming it directly becomes too costly. Wars in such a world would often stall. The balance between attack and defense would tip toward the latter. An army might swarm across plains in hours, only to halt before a cliff city that cannot be taken without years of attrition. Battles would be swift, decisive affairs, but wars would stretch long, slowed by the challenge of fortresses that rise out of reach. Stalemates would become common, borders hardened not by treaties, but by the sheer difficulty of conquering upward. And yet, such defenses would shape culture as much as strategy. Entire peoples might define themselves by their fortresses, their identity tied to the cliffs or towers that shelter them. Songs would boast of impregnable heights, legends would tell of sieges endured for generations, and architecture itself would grow as much defensive as aesthetic. To build high would be not only to aspire, but to endure. Even diplomacy would bear the imprint of height. Envoys visiting such fortresses might be required to climb or leap their way to the gates, demonstrating skill and respect before entry. Peace treaties could be signed on platforms suspended in the air, symbolizing balance between two sides. To be seen high upon the battlements would not only be a mark of military strength, but of cultural pride, a statement that a people belongs to the sky as much as to the ground. Speculation offers one final twist. Perhaps over time, war itself would lessen in frequency, not because humanity has shed its hunger for conflict, but because the cost of attacking such fortresses is too great. Stalemates would teach patience. Trade, diplomacy, and intrigue might replace conquest as the primary means of competition, for in a half-gravity world it is easier to leap across a wall than it is to bring one down. To imagine half-gravity, Earth, not as a sudden transformation, but as a condition that has always been, since the planet's beginning, is to step into a world utterly unfamiliar, a world whose every stone, tree, and creature grew under gentler rules. In such a timeline, nothing would mirror what we know. The very story of life would take a different shape, unfolding into a biosphere that seems less like the earth we walk and more like the landscapes of myth, a fantasy realm conjured not by imagination but by physics. Start with humanity itself. If our species had evolved under weaker pull, our bodies would be taller, thinner, more elongated, built not for endurance against weight, but for elegance in lightness. Bones would grow long but hollow, muscles wiry rather than thick, lungs vast to draw enough oxygen from thinner air. Our ancestors would never have walked with the sturdy gait of apes adapting to upright life. Instead, they would have leapt gracefully across savannas, their strides covering distances that here require minutes. Children would grow into adults, not by thickening, but by lengthening, beings so tall and delicate that they would seem to our eyes like walking silhouettes of reeds, but humanity is only one note in the song of life. The entire biosphere would answer to half-gravity. Trees, unburdened by the crushing weight of their own trunks, could rise hundreds of meters, their canopies lost in the thin veil of higher skies. Forests would not be low roofs of green but vertical cathedrals, endless pillars stretching upward, connected by bridges of vine and root. Walking through them would feel like moving at the bottom of a living ocean, sunlight filtering down in shafts that take minutes to reach the ground. Animals, too, would expand into giants. Insects, limited on our Earth by the oxygen demands of their bodies, might grow to sizes that rival mammals. Dragonflies with wingspans of meters, beetles the size of dogs, mantises that stalk through the underbrush like tigers. Birds would soar far higher, their wings adapted to ride the endless thermals of thin air, their migrations spanning hemispheres without effort. Herbivores might grow into creatures the size of buildings, their long necks reaching into the canopies of sky forests, while predators stretch into elegant titans, fast yet impossibly fragile, their bones like glass but their strides, long enough to cover valleys in moments. Even oceans would feel otherworldly. Waves, already vast in half-gravity, would cradle creatures of unimaginable size. Whales could grow larger still, their bodies unburdened, their songs echoing across entire seas. Coastal waters might teem with jellyfish as tall as towers, their slow pulses sending them drifting endlessly along tides that stretch deep inland. Coral reefs would rise higher, branching into tree-like structures that climb toward the surface, whole cities of stone and living color suspended in water that no longer crushes as it does here. Climate, too, would shape this fantastical earth. Storms would stretch across continents, moving with the patience of centuries, ecosystems growing around their lingering presence. Snow would fall in drifts that take months to reach the ground, blanketing landscapes in curtains of white so slow that life adapts to live among the flakes themselves. Fires would burn tall and ghostly, reshaping forests with slow pillars of flame. Every process we know would be stretched, lengthened, softened, yet magnified, and civilizations growing in this cradle would not resemble our own. Architecture, from the beginning, would reach upward, buildings designed not to resist collapse, but to embrace height. Cities would resemble forests of towers, their structures merging with the living trees themselves. Transportation would evolve first not as wheels but as wings, gliders and sails that carry humans across rivers, valleys, even entire mountain ranges. Exploration would not mean trudging across continents, but leaping and gliding through them. Speculation suggests that culture itself would take on a dreamlike quality. Myths would not describe gods dwelling in distant heavens, for humanity would already live within the sky's embrace. Instead, deities might be imagined as titans of air and light, spirits that drift among clouds and trees, companions rather than unreachable lords. Rituals might not involve descent into caves or earth, but ascent into the canopy, where temples of woven branches and stone spires rise above seas of green. To stand in such a world would be to feel disoriented, caught between awe and unease. Nothing would carry the solidity we know. Everything would seem taller, larger, lighter, stranger. Earth would not feel like the heavy, grounded planet we inhabit. It would feel like an alien exoplanet, a place of giants and endless skies, a fantasy world that grew not from stories, but from the simple act of halving gravity's pull. If it's breathtaking to imagine a world that always lived in half gravity, it is terrifying to consider what would happen if our present Earth suddenly shifted. Unlike a gradual shaping of life over eons, this change would be an immediate breaking of laws every organism has been built to obey. Gravity is not a detail of our existence. It is its foundation. Remove half its strength in a single instant, and the world does not simply transform. It collapses. The first hours would be filled with confusion. A cup slips from a table and it doesn't crash. It drifts, shattering more slowly. A person trips, and instead of a painful thud, they float clumsily before hitting the ground. Children laugh at their newfound ability to leap higher, to hang in the air for a moment longer. For a brief window, it feels like liberation, as though Earth itself has become a playground, but behind that wonder, catastrophe begins to unfold. The human body, evolved to carry the weight of flesh and bone against constant pressure, would begin to unravel. Muscles, built for tension, would no longer work the same way. Every step would require less effort, every breath drawn from air that now feels thinner, stretched higher into the sky. Hearts would strain in unexpected ways, pumping blood through vessels no longer tuned to pressure they once relied upon. Bones, already shaped for balance against weight, would begin to weaken. Within generations, humanity would become taller and more fragile. But before adaptation, there would be sickness, dizziness, heart problems, bone density loss, a fragility echoing the conditions astronauts face after months in orbit. Animals would fare even worse. Elephants, rhinoceroses, giraffes, creatures whose bodies depend on heavy bones and muscles to keep their bulk stable, would stumble into extinction. Their hearts and circulatory systems, designed to pump against Earth's full gravity, would fail. Birds, suddenly freed from much of the effort of flight, might at first thrive, but their balance with ecosystems would collapse. Predators would dominate skies. Prey would vanish, cycles of survival breaking like glass. Insects, no longer bound by weight, could surge in size across a few generations, destabilizing food webs that cannot adapt quickly enough. Ecosystems would unravel. Rivers would spread wider, slower, drowning farmland. Forests would grow taller but fragile, their trunks unable to hold shape in storms. Fires would burn longer, climbing higher into thinner air. The great cycles of weather, tied to pressure and airflow, would shift into unfamiliar patterns, storms growing larger, droughts longer, winters colder. Crops adapted to present conditions would fail. Hunger would follow. Civilization, so dependent on balance, would stagger. Buildings designed for one gravity would not collapse immediately. They would be overbuilt for the new conditions, but the lives inside them would change. Roads and vehicles designed for weight and traction would behave unpredictably. Airplanes might suddenly climb too easily. Rockets veer off course. Ships ride waves that grow taller and slower. Every technology that relies on the physics of today would require reinvention. Speculative extremes point toward catastrophe. Within decades, famine and disease spread as agriculture fails. Within centuries, extinction cascades across ecosystems. Humanity, already weakened by fragile bones and failing health, might not survive without radical adaptation, genetic engineering, technological life support, or migration into controlled environments. The planet itself would not become uninhabitable, but it would become alien to those who once thrived upon it. And perhaps this is the cruelest vision, not instant destruction, but a slow unraveling. A single generation might remember the world as it was, gravity firm, earth steady. Their children would grow sick, their grandchildren fragile, their great-grandchildren strangers to the old earth, stretched tall and thin, clinging to survival in cities adapted to low oxygen and unstable climate. In stories, they would speak of a past where the ground felt heavier, where the world was strong, where life carried solidity. To them, it would sound like a myth. In the end, a sudden halving of gravity would not free humanity. It would doom it, not with an explosion, but with a long fragile collapse, an extinction event written not in fire but in air. To truly grasp the strangeness of a half-gravity Earth, we must step outward into the solar system, where the pull of worlds, tells different stories. Gravity is the unseen hand shaping every planet's fate. It sculpts mountains, holds seas, breathes life into atmospheres, or fails to. When we place our imagined Earth beside its neighbors, we see how profoundly gravity defines the difference between barrenness and abundance, between silence and song. Begin with Mars, the red wanderer, forever a subject of fascination. Its gravity measures just over 1/3 of Earth's. To human muscles and bones, that feels like liberation. Astronauts report bounding steps, leaps that hang in the air, bodies suddenly light after a lifetime of heaviness. Yet beneath this gift lies loss. Mars cannot hold a thick, life-nourishing atmosphere. Its skies are thin and dry, unable to cradle clouds for long. Winds scour the surface but carry little force. Dust storms stretch for weeks yet soundless, muffled by lack of pressure. Water, our most ancient companion, cannot flow freely. Streams vanish into frost or evaporate into sky. If Mars once bore oceans, they are now only whispers beneath the crust, salty relics locked away. Gravity here is too weak to hold richness. It offers the freedom of leaps, but not the security of rivers. Now turn to our moon, Earth's eternal companion, glowing silver in the night. Its gravity is a mere 1/6 of Earth's, a feather touch, barely enough to keep rocks from floating into space. The Apollo astronauts did not walk so much as bounce, bounding in slow arcs, their every movement theatrical in lightness. Yet the beauty of those leaps is matched by desolation. No air softens the horizon, no seas reflect the sky. The moon's lightness stripped it of atmosphere entirely, leaving a world of silence under a black sky where stars blaze unblinking. No rivers, no clouds, no forests, only a scarred face marked by meteors that struck with full force, never slowed by air. The moon shows us the far end of lightness, a place where gravity failed to guard life's possibility. Between these two worlds, Mars too, light to hold seas, the moon too light to hold even air, lies the imagined balance of a half-gravity Earth. Unlike them, such a planet would still keep its skies, though stretched thinner, higher, paler than ours. It would still host oceans, though restless and exaggerated, sloshing violently against reshaped coasts. Its rivers would still wind across continents, though slower, wider, less decisive. Life would remain, but not as we know it. Trees would climb higher, animals would grow larger, humans would be taller, frailer, more fragile. It would be a middle world, neither barren like the moon, nor desperate like Mars, but habitable in its own peculiar way. This halfway state is what makes the vision uncanny. A half-gravity Earth is not an alien wasteland, nor is it the full, robust Earth we know. It is both familiar and strange, a dream version of home. You could walk across its plains and still see forests, rivers, mountains, but they would all be exaggerated, stretched, unstable. Clouds would linger, rain would fall slower, voices would carry differently. It is Earth wearing a mask of fantasy, a version balanced uneasily between stability and collapse. Speculative reflections extend further. Imagine the astronomers of this lighter Earth gazing outward. To them Mars would appear as a younger sibling, a cousin in frailty, a world with even less pull, a barren mirror that warns of what happens if gravity slips too far. They might see it as a failed Earth, a reminder that their own world clings precariously to habitability. The moon with its feather touch pull would be more frightening still, not a companion to inspire poetry, but a constant symbol of absence, a lifeless rock too weak to hold even the breath of life. And then they would look to our Earth, the Earth as we know it, with full gravity, and to them it would seem almost monstrous, a heavy planet, oppressively strong, holding its seas and skies in an iron grip. Its creatures, compact and muscular, would seem brutish. Its forests, shorter and denser, would seem stunted. They might marvel at its stability while fearing its weight, imagining it as a place where beings are crushed into strength, their myths not of air and lightness, but of endurance and burden. Our earth would appear to them as alien as their own would appear to us. This is the strange middle earth, too light to be solid, too heavy to be barren, a planet that supports life, but life stretched to fragility, a world not doomed like Mars, not empty like the moon, but dreamlike, always in balance, never quite at rest, habitable yet uneasy. To live here would be to know both freedom and fear, to walk a line where gravity grants enough to survive but not enough to feel secure. In this cosmic spectrum of weight and possibility, a half-gravity Earth would be a reminder. Habitability is not a single state, but a balance. Too much pull, and life is pressed into endurance. Too little, and life cannot hold on at all. Between them lies this imagined world, where existence is possible but precarious, beautiful yet unstable, forever reminding its inhabitants that they live in the fragile middle ground between weight and air. If the solar system teaches us anything, it is that gravity is destiny, but it is the wider galaxy that opens our imaginations further, because astronomers now believe that planets with gravity lower than Earth's may not be rare. They may be among the most common worlds circling other stars. When we think of a half-gravity Earth, we are not dreaming of an impossibility. We are imagining a type of planet that may already be waiting for us, scattered through the Milky Way, like distant reflections of what our world might have been. Exoplanet hunters, peering with telescopes into the night sky, have identified thousands of distant worlds. Many fall into the category of super-Earths or mini-Neptunes, planets heavier than Mars but lighter than our Earth, straddling the line between rocky and gaseous. A significant fraction of these bodies are predicted to have surface gravities around half of ours, not too weak to lose all their air, not strong enough to pin life into the dense heaviness we know, but balanced in the fragile middle. If life exists elsewhere, it may find its cradle not on Earth-like planets, but on these lighter cousins. Imagine such worlds, skies stretched high into pale blue domes, seas sprawling wider, clouds lingering for weeks instead of days, trees rising impossibly tall, their canopies forming forests in the sky, creatures larger and more delicate than anything on Earth, walking on legs that seem too thin to hold them, yet perfectly adapted to the gentler pull. Civilizations may thrive in towers and spires, their cultures shaped by lightness, their myths filled not with weight and burden, but with air, ascent, and release. Speculative visions stretch further still. Perhaps there are entire species who see our Earth as alien, a planet of crushing gravity, its life thick and compact, its creatures stunted by heaviness. To them, our movements would appear awkward, our myths of weight oppressive, our cultures bound to soil rather than sky. They would not imagine gods in the heavens, because their lives would already be steeped in upward motion. For them the divine might be found in the ground itself, the rare act of sinking, of rooting, of holding still. And one day humanity might stand among them. With rockets that burned less fuel in half-gravity, space exploration would advance centuries earlier, spreading civilizations outward across their stars. From such planets, it would be far easier to become interstellar, easier to build ships, easier to dream of colonization. If life thrives on these worlds, it may already be far older, far more advanced than we are, beings who took to the stars before we learned to write, their civilizations lifted by the simple grace of weaker pull. But there is a mirror here too. If we ever visit a half-gravity world, whether by exploration or settlement, we will see not only alien skies but a reflection of ourselves. It will be like stepping into the dream we have been weaving, leaping farther, breathing thinner, gazing up at clouds that linger like sculptures. It will remind us of what Earth could have been, had its balance been tilted just slightly. And it will raise a haunting question. What if those worlds are not empty? What if life has already grown there, fragile and towering, graceful and strange? To walk on such a planet would not only be science, it would be poetry. It would be standing in our own thought experiment, watching it bloom into reality. A half-gravity world would no longer be speculation, but home, mirror, and challenge. It would ask us not only how we adapt to lightness, but how we live alongside those who have known it forever. Life under half-gravity would be transformed not only in the sweep of history or the shape of civilizations, but in the smallest motions of the body. The ordinary tasks that structure a day, walking, lifting, resting, even breathing, would unfold differently, subtly yet profoundly altered by a world that pulls with only half its strength. To live here would be to inhabit a new rhythm, one where each movement is elongated, every fall slower, every effort reshaped. Walking itself would lose its heaviness. On earth as we know it, each step is a negotiation with weight. The foot strikes the ground, the muscles absorb shock, the bones resist collapse. In half-gravity, that impact softens. Each stride becomes a glide, less a march across the ground than a floating progression forward. Streets would be filled with people who seem to drift rather than stomp, their motions fluid, their pace deceptively fast. To an observer from our Earth, it might look like everyone is walking in slow motion, yet covering ground with effortless grace. Carrying loads would feel easier. A basket of water, a bundle of firewood, a pack of supplies, all would weigh half as much. Farmers could haul larger harvests, builders could lift greater stones, merchants could travel farther with fewer beasts of burden. Yet this gift is tempered by fragility. The bones and muscles of such people, never tested by heavy strain, would be weaker. A stumble under a burden might snap fragile limbs. Communities would adapt not only through strength, but through care. Harnesses to steady loads, communal systems to prevent overexertion, cultural proverbs warning against recklessness with weight. Domestic life would reshape itself around these changes. Homes could be built with higher ceilings, stairs steeper, ladders more common. Furniture might rise taller, rooms more vertical, designed to accommodate bodies that stretch longer and climb with ease. Everyday tools would be lighter, thinner, requiring less strength but greater precision. Even cooking would feel altered, pots hanging higher over flames, water boiling differently in thinner air, food carrying aromas more faintly through rooms where sound and scent disperse slowly. Play too would change. Children would leap from rooftops into courtyards, not in danger, but in delight. Games would involve climbing towers, gliding from platforms, tumbling in mid-air before landing in laughter. Injuries would still come, fragile bones crack easily, but protective rituals would grow around childhood, communities cushioning spaces with woven mats, designing playgrounds as arenas of air. Entire arts of balance might emerge, where children learn early not only to walk and run, but to leap and twist, mastering the choreography of lightness as naturally as breathing. Rest would also feel different. Beds could be thinner, softer, since bodies press with less force. Hammocks might be more common, swaying gently with movements that would feel exaggerated under lighter pull. Sleep itself could carry a dreamlike quality, bodies less weighed down, breath slower, the entire act of rest more like floating than sinking. Speculative visions extend into labor. Farmers might cultivate fields that stretch vertically, climbing vines and scaffold to tend crops suspended in air. Builders would construct scaffolds that rise hundreds of meters, workers scaling them without fear of collapse. Markets could be tiered, with stalls stacked above one another in layers, shoppers moving upward and downward as easily as outward. Even transportation within cities might shift from roads to vertical lifts, platforms rising between towers, gliders drifting between districts. Yet fragility remains the thread that binds daily life. Every task, every game, every moment of ease would carry the shadow of risk. A fall might be slower, but bones are weaker, a load lighter, but the body more delicate. Societies would grow cautious, layering daily routines with safety. Floors might be padded, stairs curved rather than sharp, communal care woven into every household. Over time, this would not feel like restriction, but like culture itself, a shared awareness that lightness is both a gift and a danger. Philosophy would echo in these routines. Proverbs might remind children, the world is gentle, but your bones are gentler. Festivals might celebrate the art of balance. Daily meals might include rituals of gratitude for air and sky. Daily life in half-gravity would not be mundane. It would be a constant reminder of the strangeness of existence, a blending of freedom and fragility, written into every step, every breath, every glance upward at clouds that seem to linger forever. In a half-gravity world, childhood would be both a wonder and a challenge. From their earliest years, children would grow taller, thinner, and more elongated than any we know, freed from the constant pressure that shapes bodies into sturdiness on our earth. Their bones would stretch like reeds, their frames delicate yet flexible, their movements long and graceful. A toddler learning to walk would seem less to stumble than to float, each step carrying them farther than expected, each fall softened, but still dangerous for fragile limbs. Growth itself would be accelerated in length rather than bulk. The very silhouette of youth would appear alien to us, slender, elongated, almost ethereal. Play would be the great theater, where lightness reveals itself most vividly. Children would leap from walls and rooftops as naturally as our children run across fields. Games of tag would not be confined to streets, but would spill upward into scaffolds, towers, and trees, transforming entire neighborhoods into playgrounds of air. Climbing would become instinctive, not just for the strong but for every child, their bodies tuned to pull upward with ease. Leaping between branches, gliding down with sails or cloth wings, performing flips in slow arcs before landing, such feats would be woven into the very fabric of childhood. Parents and communities would adapt with both delight and caution. On one hand, the sight of children drifting through air, laughing as they tumble in slow motion, would be celebrated as the joy of a lighter world. On the other, every parent would know the shadow behind the laughter, bones that snap easily, accidents that heal slowly, fragility that haunts every fall. Playgrounds would be padded with moss or woven mats. Festivals of youth would feature displays of controlled leaps rather than reckless dives, and early education would include not only letters and numbers, but lessons in balance, grace, and safety. The cultural impact would be profound. In such a world, childhood would not be remembered as a time of clumsy stumbles, but as a season of flight. Adults would look back not on scraped knees, but on soaring leaps, the sense of the sky welcoming them. Poetry and music would celebrate these early years. songs describing children as sky dancers, stories portraying them as beings closer to the air than to the ground. A culture might even revere childhood itself as the purest stage of life, a moment when humanity is most free from gravity's pull, most aligned with the dream of lightness. Speculative visions suggest entire traditions growing from this. Coming-of-age ceremonies could involve leaps from high platforms, each child demonstrating control, grace, and courage in midair. Communities might mark milestones not by birthdays but by height, as children stretch taller and thinner, their growth measured against towers or temple spires. Even myth might shape itself around these fragile giants, portraying children as closer to the divine, their laughter echoing like the voices of sky spirits, their games seen as rehearsals for the freedom of the soul. Education would be reshaped as well. Classrooms might be vertical spaces, children seated in tiers or floating platforms, teachers moving between levels as they instruct. Lessons would not only cover reading or numbers, but aerial coordination, safe landing techniques, and the physics of half-gravity. Science would not be an abstract subject, but a daily necessity, understanding how far one can leap, how to fall safely, how to share the sky with others. Childhood would become a time not only of learning about the world, but of mastering the new laws of motion that define it. Even family structures might reflect this change. Older siblings would be responsible for guiding the leaps of younger ones, parents designing homes with wide open interiors and soft landings. Community spaces would be filled with nets, platforms, and climbing frames, not luxuries, but essential environments for growth. In this sense, childhood would not be confined to the private sphere, but would be a communal experience, shared and celebrated by all. Speculatively, the memory of such growth would shape adulthood itself. The elongated forms of adults would carry echoes of their youth, but the freedom of leaping and the joy of aerial play would always be remembered as a golden time. Festivals of remembrance might celebrate not ancestors, but childhood itself, honoring the years when humans were closest to the sky. And perhaps in art and literature, the image of the child leaping into air would become a symbol of hope, renewal, and the enduring dream of lightness. A half-gravity Earth would be a place of wonder, but also of fragility. It would stretch the familiar into the fantastic, transforming mountains into spires, trees into green cathedrals, rivers into white mirrors that drift instead of rush. Humanity would be taller, thinner, more graceful, but also more vulnerable. Life would move with ease, yet always under the shadow of fragility, lungs straining for thinner air, bones that break with sudden force, societies that must weave caution into every step. And so the question rises like a storm cloud at the edge of imagination. Would this lighter earth be a paradise of freedom, a place where gravity no longer presses us down, where our lives unfold in grace and ascent? Or would it be a quiet doom, a world where beauty masks vulnerability, where one shift, one accident, one storm too great could unravel it all? Perhaps the truth lies in both. Such a planet would be wondrous, an earth of dreamlike scale and breathtaking skies, but it would also be precarious, balanced always between survival and collapse. To live there would be to know the poetry of lightness, but also its cost. Picture at last its horizon, endless towers rising into pale skies, forests like columns holding up veils of cloud, oceans glimmering wider than thought. And among them, humans leaping across rooftops, silhouettes stretched against the fading light, moving like shadows freed from the weight of the ground. a species caught between earth and sky, dancing across a world where gravity barely holds them down.